Hello, everyone. Firstly, nice to meet you all virtually from the past for you guys, because I'm recording this slightly in advance, but we're going to pretend it's live. So my name is Nick Massey. I am 27, and I was diagnosed with Ewing Sarcoma when I was 16, so back in 2010. So it's 31st of August 2010, and I'm just going to tell you a bit of kind of what I had, what treatment I had, what I went through, and then kind of life in the 10 years after treatment, and kind of what that consisted of and what that looked like. So I've started with a fairly innocuous photo of a needle in my arm. So this was a photo I rediscovered in 2018 on a very, very old phone, and I looked at the timestamp on the photo, and this was taken on the day I was diagnosed, after I'd had my ultrasound, after I'd had a CT of my chest, hence the needle, but before I was diagnosed. So it was a bit of a weird one to find, and I just thought, it's the first, I didn't know it at the time when the photo was taken, but it's the first photo of my cancer journey, and you're going to be seeing a few more. Some of them medical, some of them more humorous, kind of, showing my unique way that my sense of humor has helped me get through some of the tougher times. So to start with, this was me pre-cancer. This was after I'd been diagnosed, and as you can clearly see, I was checking to see what I was going to look like bald. But yeah, that was me when I was 16 with hair, and then also 16 me with hair, but hiding it, and as you can now see, it looks great. So that's a big win. I had finished my GCSEs and was about 1 or 2 weeks away from starting sixth form, at my local sixth form college. I had had a pain in my right knee for 6 months. It had started to wake me up. It was intermittent. It would be there for a few days and then gone, there for a few weeks and then gone. But it was starting to get worse. I've been to the doctor a few times about it. He'd initially said it was Osgood slatters, so as I'm sure other people have potentially been told, it's where supposedly your growth plates don't grow properly, as you can't see at the moment. I'm about 6'2", 6'3", and mostly leg. So they thought it was this. I was back and forth to the doctors a few times, and on the final trip to the GP, I pointed out that I had a weird lump on my lower back. He had a feel of it, has a squeeze, kind of just like said it was a bit unusual, nothing to worry about. They put me in for an ultrasound, but more importantly, they were going to get me in for some physio for the knee. So the ultrasound was initially booked for 12 weeks time, but my mum, who's a nurse, she said she had a bit of a funny feeling about the knee, about the lump rather, and she rang up the ultrasound group and asked them if there was any chance of moving it forward. And luckily enough, an unknown person working in that group somehow managed to save my life, unbeknownst to them, by ringing back about an hour later and saying there'd been a cancellation for that Monday. So on the 31st of August, I went for some physiotherapy about the knee, and they were bending it around, pushing it around. And then that afternoon at about 4 p.m, I went for an ultrasound. The ultrasound couldn't get the full image of what they were scanning on the screen. So I then had an x-ray of my pelvis, and then they followed up with the chest CT. And at that point, they took me and my mum into a room and said, you have a malignant growth on your pelvis, and you're going to have to go to the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham for a biopsy to find out for certain what it is. And then we got the fun drive home, where a friend texted me to ask if everything was okay. And I asked my mum, I was like, what do I say? And she was like, just say yes and deal with it later. And I don't think the friend never really forgave me for that. So I get home, my mum then has to tell my dad, I have to tell my then girlfriend, which was, quite a thing to do at 16. It's one of them things that you actually the older you get, the more you kind of think about it and think, oh, that was one hell of a number to drop on someone on a Monday afternoon. So then the next day I go for a bone scan at a hospital, and the doctor that morning gives me the results of the CT, and she does the look that may be familiar, unfortunately familiar to some of you, where they tilt the head to the side and they look really sympathetic and they've got a slight sad look in their eyes, and they say the words, "Unfortunately, it has spread." So that was that, and then I was fine, oddly enough. My dad passed out and my mum started crying, which was a bit of a number. But yeah, I was strangely okay with it. And then, yeah, later that day I had the bone scan, and then I had an MRI of the pelvis. So from those two, they said it looks like I've got little dots all over. I saw the bone scan myself, and I was basically lit up like a Christmas tree. And they had bits on the skull, bits on the spine, on the ribs, fairly out there. And then the pelvis scan, pelvis MRI showed up this. So you can see here, on this side we've got my chest X-ray. So this chest X-ray was actually done after I started chemotherapy, because you can see I've got my portacath in, but you can see the various shadows on the lungs. And then the other one is you don't need to be a radiographer to see the thing there that looks slightly out of place. And that was my primary. So it was fairly sizable. This scan itself was actually taken after chemotherapy. So that's what it was like after about 6 months of chemo. So it was fairly sizable. But it had wrapped around the top of the iliac bone in my pelvis. So it was quite hard for them to, it wasn't sticking out very much, basically. So initial presentation, I had a fairly sizable primary on my pelvis. I had it in my lungs, and I think the biggest one in the lungs was like 4 by 5 centimeters. I think that's the one you can see on what would be my right hand side, so the left hand side of the picture. Dots on my skull. So I had a very weird sensation the day after I diagnosed. I felt like someone was pressing down the side of my face, and they ended up doing a CT of my head. And what basically it turned out, there was a small tumor here that was pressing down on the nerve for the side of my face, and had lots and lots of ones about the size of a 1 or 2 pence piece all over my skull, and then other bits on the spine, on the left side of the pelvis, on the sacrum, at the top of my left leg, and yeah, so it was fairly well there. I started treatment in September 2010. So I had VIDE. Initially I had 6 rounds of VIDE, so vincristine, ifosfamide, doxorubicin, and etoposide. And I was treated at Leeds General Infirmary on the Clarendon wing. So, big support for that ward. Possibly my favourite hospital ward. I have to say all others, pale in comparison. Sorry, guys. So that was when I started treatment. So I had it through then until the February. In the February, I had it shrank, and it didn't, and this was something that was hard for me to deal with. It didn't disappear completely, which was very worrying for me at the time, because I was like, if it's not disappearing completely, doesn't that mean it is still there? And yeah, I did the thing that they told me not to, which was a lot of googling around Ewing sarcoma, and I think at the time there was a lot of websites in the US. There was a lot of kind of like not false information, but it just wasn't necessarily true for my case. It was very like US specific, and it was only kind of as I kind of came onto like the Bone Cancer Research Trust website that I started to get like a decent understanding of kind of what was going on, and what it was, and what my future would look like, and to actually interact with other patients. I think one of the main things that kind of get me going at this point was that I met other Ewings and other like osteosarcoma patients on the teenage ward, some of whom I stayed in contact with for years afterwards. So that was, it was a good resource to have, and kind of made it a bit less terrifying at the time. After I'd had the 6 rounds of VIDE, they did a CT of my chest, and it looked like a new tumor had started to grow, which after 6 rounds of VIDE wouldn't have been great. Luckily enough, it turns out that there was like a CT scan had taken a slice at like a slightly different level, so it wasn't a new growth. It just looked like one. So after like 1 round of holding chemo, I then started my high dose and my stem cell transplant. So they used my own stem cells for it, so there wasn't a risk of host graft disease. And I was in hospital, I think, for about 6 weeks in isolation, while I had that done. After that, I had a few weeks off, and then I started, radiotherapy. I think for 6 weeks at Jimmy's in Leeds. So I live on the East Coast, so I was driving across and driving back every day, and also learning how to drive at the same time, which my mum was really pleased about. That her cancer patient son was driving her to and from Leeds on a daily basis, and we had a few near misses on the A64 there and back. But yeah, so then I finished treatment in what would have been July 2011. And here are some photos of me in treatment. So this was me about a month after I'd lost my hair, and I decided that I blended in quite well with some mannequins, and I wanted I wanted to get the photo. And then this would have been me in Christmas 2010. So as you can see, the old eyebrows and eyelashes are starting to go. And yeah, I was just on chemo and on the ward. It was a very weird Christmas, to be stuck in hospital, but generally, as good as it could have been. And then these are 2 other ones of me. So this one, I was slightly ahead of the game on the mask front. It's, only appears in like 2020 that everyone else caught up. And then the other one, this is me after I'd had my high dose. So this was after I'd finished my high dose treatment and we'd been allowed to go home. So I think this was the point where I think I'd lost quite a lot of weight, and it's one of the photos I look back on and like, actually, I look quite ill there. But at the time, you don't really realize it. You don't really perceive yourself as it, which is always quite strange. So life after treatment has been particularly interesting. So I spent probably the 5 years from 2011 thinking that it was going to come back, because I'd like I said, I'd done a lot of reading online. I think I'd struggled to find people that had metastatic Ewings and then kind of been okay with it. So I don't know, it was a real attitude changer for me. I think I threw myself into life a bit more afterwards, just because I was like, at the time I was very conscious of the fact that it might not be much longer. So I did a few things. I ended up speaking at the Royal Albert Hall, and I started getting more involved in charity work, and that continued. I suppose I really knuckled down for my A-levels, which I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So it was a real shift in perspective for me. And I ended up going to LSE for uni. I moved to Australia for a bit. I've done the London Marathon for Bone Cancer Research Trust. That was 2019. Fingers crossed for the Ironman for next year. And just really got involved in all aspects of life in its many different guises. And I think some of that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been ill. So I got the all clear in 2016. Which was, a very, very strange one, a very strange point to be at. Something that I think, deep down, I don't think I had expected to reach. And then, just continued from there, really. So in terms of where I am now, I finished uni in 2017. I worked for a bit and then decided I wanted to go back and do a master's, and then moved to Iceland. And then I've now moved back to the UK, and trying to get more involved with charity stuff at the moment. And I'm also slowly creeping my way into medical research, working as a patient advocate. So I'm now part of the Euro Ewings Consortium as a patient advocate for their radiation working group. And I really recommend it. people go have a look at that, get involved in it. I think it can be a bit intimidating, but the the academics are very, very happy to kind of have you there, or at least if they're not, they haven't told me otherwise. So that's kind of my a basic run through of my story and background. I think with regards what my I suppose takeaway points would be, I think it's important to kind of think about just how useful having the information there at the start is. So I think that's one thing that obviously Bone Cancer Research Trust is huge for, and it's an absolute lifesaver, both figuratively and literally, is that it can feel very lonely, even if you're surrounded by family, you've got a doctor there who's able to talk to you, but speaking to other patients is really useful, particularly when it's such a rare disease, kind of having people that can say, yes, I've had that chemotherapy and it's horrendous, but you can do it, you can be okay, you can make your way through it. And also, the longer term follow-up. So even though I'm 10 years clear of treatment, there are still days where, it's there. It's obviously, it is and always will be a kind of a presence in my life, but it's about making sure that that's something that, you can still have people to speak to. And, hopefully, I think the fundraising for the treatment side of stuff is important, but equally so is the community aspect. And I think, it's not a particularly nice disease. It's not one I'd really wish on anyone. But it feels very weird to say, but I think people always ask me, do you wish it hasn't happened? And I think the answer to that is no. I'm not glad that it happened, but I don't wish it hadn't, just because I think it influenced so many, parts of my life. And I think, with a bit of work, you can make it into a positive overall. I don't imagine I would have run a marathon for charity if I hadn't been ill. Secondly, I don't imagine many people would have sponsored me if I was just doing it for something that wasn't such a personal connection. So that'd be my, my real, I suppose, closing remark as such, is that, the charity work that Bone Cancer Research just does is important, not just the research, but the community it provides. Like this conference, for example, as much as it is digital, I'm sure there'll be face-to-face ones in the future. And kind of, looking at that and kind of thinking how can, and understanding, I suppose, how such a unique and unusual disease can, bring people together and not necessarily just affect your life in a, in a sad that it happened way, but you can kind of really spin some positives out of it and use it as a bit of a motivator. But yeah, that's basically my result. And I hope to speak to you and meet you guys all face to face at some point in the future.